Today I'm going to talk to you about literacy practices in the social studies. My name is Todd Beach. I am an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota. I'm the lead teacher in the social studies in ISD 196. I'm also a consultant for the College Board. We're going to begin by talking about what it means, what the purpose of schooling, and we're talking first of all about citizenship. And we'll begin with this little quote: "Citizenship comes by grace, and grace comes by art, and art does not come easy," with apologies to Norman MacLean. But as we think about the purpose of schooling, public schools and public universities have one mission, and that is to develop citizens who can, as Franklin demanded, keep a republic. Within the context of a democratic group or society, from a family to a nation, people have a choice between two identities. One can be a subject or a citizen. That's it. A republic demands citizens because only citizens are capable of self-government, and only citizens can create and sustain a civic culture. And that's from H. Michael Hartunian, Professor Emeritus at the University of Minnesota. And we begin this way because the one thing that all of our citizens have to be is they have to be literate. They have to have the skills of critical literacy, and as social studies teachers, that's really one of our main focuses that we have to get into. Is I know so often we get caught up in content, but we have to be teachers of literacy as well. So the aims of the presentation today, we're going to talk about using multiple and diverse texts. This is really important because so many of our social studies teachers, especially in high schools, are so wrapped up in just using their textbook, but we really want to break beyond the textbook and use multiple and diverse texts. And then we're going to talk about sourcing, corroboration, and contextualization as we use all kinds of text in our work with students. And today we're going to begin with a poem to introduce these concepts. Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with names of kings. Was it kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? And Babylon, so many times destroyed, who built the city up each time? In which of Lima's houses, the city glittering with gold, lived those who built it? In the evening, when the Chinese wall was finished, where did the masons go? Imperial Rome is full of arcs of triumph. Who reared them up? Over whom did the Caesars triumph? Byzantium lives in song. Were all her dwellings palaces? And even in Atlantis of the legend, the night the sea rushed in, the drowning men still bellowed for their slaves. Young Alexander conquered India. He alone? Caesar beat the Gauls. Was there not even a cook in his army? Philip of Spain wept as his fleet was sunk and destroyed. Were there no other tears? Frederick the Great triumphed in the 7 Years' War. Who triumphed with him? Each page of victory. At whose expense the victory ball? Every 10 years a great man. Who paid the piper? So many particulars, so many questions. So we begin with this poem because as I use this poem at the beginning of the year with my students, I want them to start thinking about history in a different way. And I always give them this text on a sheet of paper so they can look at it and go back. And it makes them think about history very differently than the narrative they're used to seeing in their textbooks. And so the next thing that we do is we want to interrogate this poem. And I'll ask them a series of questions. So with the partner, I want you to think and talk through these following questions. What is the author trying to say about history through this poem? And then I want you to speculate. I mean, we don't know, but what do you think motivated the author to write this poem? And the poem has a title. I've purposely left it off. But if you could title a poem, what would you title it and why? And what more would you like to know about this particular text? So these are the questions I let students struggle with and think about, and then they share out. And of course, we get to the answer, and they always want to know who wrote the poem. And the poem was written by a man named Bertolt Brecht. And the first thing I asked him to look at is look at the years of his life. You can see when he was living. And you see, first of all, at least what I noticed, is that he didn't live to be a very old man. I know that my students probably think 58 is old, but it really isn't. And so they're curious about this life and why it ended so abruptly or short. We learned that he was a German Marxist poet, playwright, and theater director. So that term Marxist means something, and especially if students know the term, then the poem makes a lot more sense. The interesting thing about Brecht is that if you were a German Marxist poet, and his story is so interesting because he left Germany when Hitler came into power, and because he's a poet and a playwright and a theater director, there's really only one place in the world that you really want to be during that period of time, and that was New York City. So he moved to Scandinavian countries and tried to get a visa to come to the United States. It took him a couple of years. And then he came to the United States, he worked in New York City. But again, you think about the years of his life and you put that together with the context of what you know about what was going on in world history in the 40s and the early 50s, his views as a Marxist brought him a lot of attention in America. And he had to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee during the Red Scare. And what would a Marxist title the poem? A Worker Reads History. And so what's important to understand as we begin with this poem is that we really are starting to use a different lens to examine history. And that's the first lesson I want my students to learn. So today we're going to talk about using multiple and diverse texts. And I always ask students, and my U of M students as well, what does the word text mean to you? And they usually come up with things like the written word, anything that's in a book. But text in the social studies context is far, far greater. Text, as you look at the screen, can be graffiti. Text can be a number of things to a social studies teacher. Text is architecture. It is sculpture. It is painting. It is music. It is film. Yes, it's the written word. But we want to use all these sources to bring our lessons alive for students, and you can't just use one textbook to do that. You really have to get your students out there and let them see these other pieces of text. Another thing that I use is artifacts as text. And so this is a key artifact, if you pardon the pun. But this is a replica key that a student gave me as a gift because the real key hangs in a very prominent place in Mount Vernon. And it fits the door to a French prison. And so it really begs the question, what is a key that fits a door to a French prison hanging in Mount Vernon in such a prominent place? But this artifact then leads us into another whole area of inquiry, and we can discover through this artifact the relationship between the French and the Americans during the American Revolution. And one of those Frenchmen who was a general under General Washington was a man named Marquis de Lafayette, as French soldiers came over and helped us in the Revolution. Well, as the story goes, and because I'm speaking to social studies teachers, you know this story, the American Revolution was successful. French soldiers go back, and in 1789, another revolution begins in France. It begins with the storming of the Bastille prison. And Marquis de Lafayette was on hand that day. The prison falls, the revolution takes place, and then many years later, Washington has died, and Lafayette decides that he's going to come back to Washington to pay homage to his old friend. And as he comes back, he's going to bring with his son with him. And they're going to bring this key that fits the door to the French prison known as the Bastille. So they come, show up at Washington's grave, and in a moment of, kind of dramatic, I guess, is that he introduces to Washington, albeit from the dead, Lafayette introduces his son, whose son's name is George Washington Lafayette. It's such a great story, and it all begins with this key as this artifact as you start these inquiry processes with students and drill down to find out more and more. Teachers have so much power, I think, when it comes to deciding how we're going to approach content with our students. We decide what type of text we're going to provide our students. We decide how we're going to engage students with those texts. And then we provide what kind of support they're going to get so it's accessible to them. So we have all these decisions we have to make, and I think so often, because we're very busy as teachers, we don't really weigh all these different ideas that we could have of approaching content using multiple texts. This is a particular painting that's from the Minneapolis Institute of Art. My student's sitting in front of that. Again, another piece of text. As social studies educators and as teacher educators, we always want to talk about linking our practices to a learning theory, and I'm going to take a moment to talk about constructivist learning theory, and that is the idea that we want students to begin with a critical stance. We all come to learning with different experiences, and so we want to begin by talking about what do you already know about this particular content, this particular time and place, and let's write that down and let's have a discussion about that. You want that as a teacher because you're going to use that information to help you figure out what steps you're going to take next. So as we talk today about multiple texts and where to begin, we always have to link it to our learning theory, and that is constructivist style learning theory. When I begin talking with my own students about how to analyze text, I usually, especially with freshman students, my younger students, I want to begin with images because they're really powerful, and students don't feel like they can get caught up in necessarily the language of what we're looking at, and they can just look at this image and start talking about what they see. And so I begin with this image, and to social studies educators, it's an iconic image. We recognize it right away, but to our 15-year-olds, they don't know this image, believe it or not. And so I ask them, you know, as you see this picture of this young woman, we need to interrogate this text. And so let's start asking some questions about it. Who is in the photograph? Now I know it's a young woman, but who is she? How old is she? Where in the world is she from? What information is the photographer, who in this piece of text is the author, trying to convey with this image? What are they trying to tell us? What's missing in the photograph that would help you learn more about this text? So I always talk to students about what do you see in the background? Because this is a portrait photograph and it's so close, it's really hard to pick up anything else in context about where this young woman might be. And then what are the questions are you forming from the image? I always ask students, and when we get back to question 1, who's in the photograph, and think about, yes, it's a young woman. Is she rich? Is she poor? And with that, then they start to kind of really analyze. They see that her clothing is a bit tattered and torn. And then I ask them, so they come to the conclusion that she's not a wealthy person. So that narrows down where this young woman could be from. Then I ask her about, what is that expression? Is she afraid? Is she caught off guard? Or is she determined? You know, I always think it's so interesting, the answers that students come up with as they look at her. And then finally, for I think all of us, what do you find most interesting about this woman? And we all say her eyes. Then I layer on some context. So if you take a look at the photograph with the context layered over the top, the National Geographic magazine, you know, for us social studies teachers, I mean, that's how we know this. That's what's so iconic about it. But there's so much more to figure out from layering this on. We can see a date now, and that gives us more context. It's in 1985. And then we can start to look at these subheadings. The Great Salt Lake, no, that's not this. U.S.-Mexican border, life on the line. Sometimes students play with that a little bit, and they go, well, maybe she could be of Mexican descent. They think about that. Then other students say, no, I'm of Mexican descent. My eyes are brown. So they'll start analyzing their way through that. Java, and sadly, most of our students don't know where Java is. And then they come to along Afghanistan's war-torn frontier, and that fits with the context that they know. And so we can work with that a little bit. But the next thing, especially with my 15-year-olds, so like, Afghanistan was at war in 1985. Who were they at war with? And so we can really start to dive down deeper into this text by using that. And through that inquiry, they figure out that there was a country at the time that they were at war with called the Soviet Union. And now they find it interesting today that the Soviet Union was at war in Afghanistan in 1985, and then today, the United States is in war in Afghanistan all these years later. And we bring on another piece. National Geographic then decided that for their 25th anniversary of this very iconic cover, they wanted to find this girl. So they sent the photographer who took this shot to look for this girl. And he went back to the village where she was from, and she wasn't there. But the elders of that village said that they recognized the picture, because that's all he had was a photograph. He didn't have a name. They recognized the picture, and they said, oh yeah, she's around, but she lives in a neighboring village. The photographer goes there, shows the picture around. He thinks he's found the girl, and he shows it to this woman, and he says, is this you? And she said, yes, that's me. And so then I asked my students, can we corroborate that? Do you believe that is the same girl? So we start to, again, analyze it. Who is this woman? Is her status in life changed? Is she rich now? Is she wealthier? But if they can bring in the context that it's Afghanistan, it's not a wealthy country, I don't believe she's wealthier. Is it the same woman? They look at the eyes, they believe it's the same woman. They look at the shape of the lips, that seems to work. It may be difficult to see on the screen, but she does have this kind of a discoloration or a blemish on the side of her nose, and that is identical. So they do conclude that it is the same woman. And then I asked them, okay, so let's do the math, because we figured out that in the picture of the girl on the left, the young girl, she was 12 years old when that picture was taken. So in 1985, she was 12. We add 25 years to that, so that makes her 37. And then I ask, do you think that looks like the face of a 37-year-old woman? Unfortunately, my 15-year-olds all say, yeah, but I personally don't think so. I think she looks really aged to me. And we talk about that. Part of it could be because in Afghanistan, women don't wear makeup. They don't do things like that with their complexion. But it also may be that in 1985, as a 12-year-old, her country is at war. Today, this woman, her country is still at war. It could have a lot to do with what she has lived through in those 25 years. And that's a good way to start to breaking down and analyzing photographs and visual text from our students to begin with photographs like this. We also want to interrogate government source images. So this is a very famous image. It's cut off at the top, but at the top there is a banner that says mission accomplished, if you can remember this image that took place with George Bush. And I asked students, I said, so let's look at this text, because this again is a photograph and it's taken by a White House photographer, and there's a reason this photograph shows up in newspapers all across the country the next day. What is the government trying to say to us through this image? And normally students, it takes them a while, but then as they start to think about this, it looks almost framed perfectly. We have men on top of a fighter jet. We have all the same color uniform standing in front of that fighter jet. In the foreground, we have hands above our head clapping. Again, you can't see the banner, but the banner above says mission accomplished. We have the president behind the rostrum with the presidential seal, thumbs up. We're on an aircraft carrier. Everything is projecting that we have done something great and amazing in this image, and that's what the government wants you, the message they're going to give you. And this is a good check to have students think twice about the kind of images that come in front of them and where they're coming from, the source of those images. And then, just for a sense of balance and fairness, we can look at this image. This was the most tweeted image of 2012. So it went viral, as they say. And so do we recognize who it is? Students right away see that they assume it's Michelle Obama. I assume it's Michelle Obama. So President and Michelle Obama. And we talk about, if it was the most tweeted image, what happened? They want more context. Well, I said it happened in November of 2012. So it helps them to understand that this probably was around the election, probably has to do with moments after it was decided that he was re-elected for president. But then I asked them, okay, let's be critical of this image, of the source of this image, the photographer. As again, as you look at this image, think about the angle of the photograph. I mean, we are looking up into the clouds. It's all billowy. There's no other context. And so, I mean, it's almost like the photographer or the author of the text has presented him as some type of a deity, if you will. We see people embracing, and the human part of us really likes that. We like to see people embrace, no matter if you agree with their politics or not. We like that warmth, that feeling. And so that image, that source, that's why it became so viral, is because there's a lot of things going on here that the White House photographer knew to frame it just so we could get that kind of feeling. knowing that that would present a message to the people that they really wanted to. We can next move away from government source images and talk about these other images. So this is from a history class. I teach European history as one of the classes I teach. And during the French Revolution, these are two portraits of sans-culotte women. These are working women of Paris, and they had a very vital part in the revolution. But one is produced by an English source, and the other is produced by a French source. And so I ask students a lot, think about this, how the image on the right is by the British source, how they're portraying this sans-culotte woman. She's all decked out in the tricolor of France. She's got the bonnet of a revolutionary and that broquette in her bonnet. Her face, though again, the image on the right, she has this very angry look, a very kind of menacing look. And then that's actually a dagger sticking through the bonnet as well. So that's how the English are portraying these sans-culotte women of France, whereas the image on the left is from a French magazine. And they portray this French sans-culotte women as very domestic and grandmotherly, if you will. We have wash on the line in the background, a cat, where we have yarn. It's very tranquil and peaceful in comparison to the image on the right. And why, I asked my students, why would these two different places identify these women so differently, and what's in it for them as we compare and contrast these sources? Statistical images, I think we underuse them in the social studies, and this is probably the world's first infographic. It's widely available on the web if you'd like to use it, and it's called the Minard Map, and it's written or created by Charles Joseph Minard in 1869. There's actually even a YouTube video that talks about this. So I use this to introduce Napoleon in history class, because what's so interesting about this image is it's written in French, so unless we have French readers and speakers, they have to just look at the image itself. But as you look at that brown band on the top, the width of the band represents troop strength. So the wider the band, the more troops Napoleon has. This is Napoleon's march from Lithuania to Moscow. Now you, as history students, know the end of the story, right? It's failed. It's a terrible decision. But what happens in the interim? And so I use this as a piece of inquiry. I just show this with students, and then we try to figure out what happened along this way. So you see the brown band going out and it ending in Moscow, and it diminishes and diminishes, meaning troop strength is lessening. And then the black band is the retreat. It is the coming back. And you see they end up with hardly any soldiers at all. It begs the question, what happened? My gosh, why did the brown band go off on the side a couple times? What's that reconnection, the black to the brown? Along the bottom of the table, you can also see, it may be hard to see, but what we have there are temperature readings as well. Now, they are not in Fahrenheit or Celsius. During the French Revolution in Napoleon's time, they actually used a very different measurement. And so we had to figure out, well, what is that? How does that convert? What is the temperature at the time? And does that having to do with how many men are dying on this retreat? It's a great exercise to begin this inquiry and to study, to understand this piece of history and why it happened that way. But then what's also fun is using this to start, but then we can layer on other pieces of text to go with it. So in the next picture, you see there is an account of that particular thing called the Diary of a Napoleonic Foot Soldier. It's written by Jacob Walter. It's widely available. And I always pull excerpts from that so we can layer that text on top of the Minard map that you see at the bottom. And then there was a Russian painter, his name is Pryishnikov, and he painted this scene. He was not witness to the scene because he paints this in like 1869, but this is his version of that French retreat. And you see these soldiers, the French soldiers, in tattered clothing, but not in winter coats. But you see the Russian peasants with very crude pitchforks and heavy winter coats kind of escorting these French soldiers out of this very barren winter landscape. And so these other pieces of text really give us another picture of what was happening. Rather than if you read this in your textbook, it's going to say he had a failed march to Moscow, this is the reason it happened, and then he retreated back to Paris. And I think this is a much deeper way to look at history. So here's an an excerpt from the diary of a Napoleonic foot soldier. From Smolensk to Mozarsk, the war displayed its horrible work of destruction. All the roads, fields, and woods lay as though sown with people, horses, wagons, burned villages and cities. Everything looked like the complete ruin of all that lived.